Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose. Affirmative.
Okay, we're back on the Investigative Journal, wrapping up Friday, June 21st, or make that July 21st, 2017 day on our calendar. I'm your host, Greg Anthony, and go to my website at arcticbeacon.com. That'll take you to another site where you can press the donate button and help us during this month on our pledge drive to keep this show on the air. We're listener-sponsored, and every little penny helps. So go to my website, and you can get articles going and shows going back over 12 years regarding what I call the Vatican-led New World Order. Okay, we're going to end the week. I'm going to do a part 2 show on remembering a friend of mine who passed away in 2012, a Lieutenant Colonel, Green Beret, Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin. And Dan, over the years, we became friends. I interviewed him many times, and incredible stories. Not only the story about the Kennedy assassination and all the tentacles that are involved in that, but one of the more interesting pieces, and in this interview, I'm not sure if he gets to it, so I want to just tell you. He commanded a Green Beret team, the A424 in South Vietnam, December 1965 to 1966. And he was the head of a 12-man Special Forces team that was ordered to attack, and it turned out that it was more than 12 men, because I talked to Dan about it, and it ended up to be a unit of almost 100. And then they were going to piece off into smaller groups. But his assignment, and the CIA, or as he calls it, the company, came and said, we want you to go into Cambodia. Now remember, during this time, there was a no-fire zone. We couldn't shoot back on the Mekong Delta according to the rules of engagement by Lyndon Baines Johnson, which really was like allowing our men to just get picked off. And they'd come down the Delta, and then the shooters would be in Cambodia, and we couldn't fire back. And in fact, Dan told me a story about one of his lieutenant friends who actually did fire back, and he was sent back to the States and court-martialed. Well, anyway, Dan's running this Green Beret team, and the company comes to him and says, listen, we want you to go into Cambodia, kill Crown Prince Sihanouk, and we're going to make it look like the National Liberation Front did it. Well, Dan says, I'll accept the position, and he gets on his way. But then he started thinking about all these men that were getting picked off on the Mekong Delta, and a lot of his friends getting killed. So when the company came to check on him as they started on their trek to Cambodia, Dan said, listen, I'm not going to do it unless you send this to Mr. Lyndon Baines Johnson and tell him to stop allow us to shoot into Cambodia so we can protect our men coming down the Mekong Delta. And the company said, listen, Dan, we tell you what to do, not the other way around. Well, the story gets really interesting because Dan continued. He was going to head back, and he ran into an ARVN unit. That's a South Vietnamese unit. And the head of that unit, the general that he befriended and became close friends with, tipped him off and said, Dan, if you continue, your men aren't going to make it. They have a stakeout, and they're going to surround you guys, and your own people are going to kill you for not carrying out the orders. So this general ended up, and Dan, he followed his advice. The general gave him an escort all the way back with his men, and nothing happened. But boy, did the you-know-what hit the fan with the general. And the general basically was blackmailed, and he lost everything. The United States CIA, they somehow said he was a drug dealer, etc., and he was shamed in his own country, banished, and ended up in Canada, right? And So years go by. Dan's back now, and he wants to help his friend get into the United States, right? So he sends a letter to then George Bush, who was president, and he sends his book, The Expendable Elite. And he had tried every avenue to get his general friend back to the States because he was dirt poor in Canada, and he wanted him to lead a better life. So he tried the congressman. He tried everything, and nothing. So finally he said, I'm sending this to George W., the Daddy Bush. And he puts a little sticky note in there and says, George, you know very well, you know who I am, and you know that I know you had CIA connections and were involved in the CIA prior to your announcement stating that you first joined the CIA in 1970. And he says, if you don't allow me to get this general back to the States, I'm going to make this public, and it's going to go a long way. So anyway, guess what? He got a note like a week later. Okay, go get your friend. Go get the general. And so he's getting ready. He's getting a U-Haul truck to go upstate New York, get into Canada, and bring his buddy and his wife back. He gets a call from one of his ex-CIA guys and says, if you go to that border, you'll never come back. They got a hit out on you. So guess what he does? He gets all his buddies from the state police, and he even got protection from one of his congressmen, and they gave him a police escort there and back. And Dan told me it was the safest place in the world to be. So he gets his general and his wife back. They end up living the rest of their lives in California. And quite a story, isn't it? Well, anyway, maybe Dan will recount that. I can't remember, but I had to get that off my chest. And like I said, Dan became a really good friend. And I'd like to dedicate the rest of this show to him. And go out and get that book, Expendable Elite. You can still get it online. You can go to expendableelite.com. It's a great book. And when Dan passed away, I don't know if he got his other book done. I'm going to have to check into that. He was working on a second one. And let's go to Dan Marvin.
That thought, we're going to take a break right now on the Investigative Journal. This is Greg Zizmansky. We'll be back in 3 minutes on the Republic Broadcasting Network.
Boy, that was something. I took a break even before I did the interview.
We're back on the Investigative Journal on the Republic Broadcasting Network. I'm your host, Greg Zizmansky. We're talking to Colonel Dan Dangerous Marvin. Dan, I'm going to have to keep you on for the second half hour. There's just too much stuff. I don't want to let you go.
It's Dangerous Dan, not Dangerous Marvin.
Okay, Dangerous Dan. How'd you get that nickname? And secondly, tell me why you finally decided. You were working as a government assassin. We're going to get into all your experiences in Vietnam. But how'd you get that name, Dangerous Dan? And secondly, why did you finally come forward like this?
Well, the name Dangerous Dan was kind of a sad thing in a way. Well, a sad thing for certain. I had a reputation when I was a sergeant first class that I was a mean sucker, and they had somebody that somebody else couldn't control. They had assigned him to me. And this one time, the company commander assigned this man to me who had been in and out of the stockade. Nobody could seem to handle him, and he brought him to me, and he says, you make him or break him. Either make a soldier out of him or cause him to desert. Because in those days, if you deserted, you reported to the post that you were nearest to when you were caught. And he was from someplace in Texas, so he assumed, the company commander did, that that's where he'd be picked up. So he put him under my wing, and I drove him pretty hard, tried to make a good soldier out of him, and one day, all of a sudden, he's gone. So the company commander was happy. I had done my job, but about, I'm not sure exactly how long later, a couple of days, he was found in the Lover's Lane outside of Fayetteville, North Carolina, near Fort Bragg, and he was dead, and so was his girlfriend. He'd killed her and then killed himself, and he left a suicide note. And in that note, he blamed the company commander, but in one sentence, he put that Sergeant Marvin should be eliminated from the Army because he's too dangerous. And the FBI came and read that note right out in front of the 42 men that worked for me at that time, and that's how I got my nickname.
So then here you are, this dangerous soldier, government, basically an assassin. Now you came forward.
Okay,
what was this big change?
In 1984, on the 29th day of January, my youngest daughter, Dana Lee, led me to the Lord Jesus Christ. And from that moment, this is hard to believe, but from that moment, I no longer feared our government sending somebody like me to kill me for coming out with the truth of some of the heinous deeds that we've been involved in. And that's exactly what happened. That's the day I started putting together this book.
And basically, for years after you got out of the service, up until 84, you had this information, but were frightened to come forward, basically, because you knew what they would do to you because what you did to other people.
That's right. That's right.
Now, some people may say, how could you have such a transformation in such a short period of time? Tell us what went, I mean, everybody's different. Tell us what went through your mind.
Well, went through, actually, from the time that I left Vietnam, believe it or not, I joined the Veterans for Peace organization because I knew then just how bad that our government was in the single action of betraying the South Vietnamese. The South Vietnamese I was with, and somebody reads my book, they'll read about 64,000 Buddhist Wahows that I served with, and 692 of them, 792 of them were under arms, under my command there in An Phu. They were the finest people I've ever met in my life, and we betrayed those people. You know, when I turned my camp over to the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, it was the most secure area in all of Vietnam. It was an independent operation. It was kind of neat because the first thing, and this is in my book, first order that I gave when I went into there was that if anybody messed with one of the local women or raped or assaulted her in any way, they would be dead within 24 hours. Well, we had an occasion a couple of weeks later where two of my strikers, that's what we called our civilian irregulars, two of our strikers were going by a native hooch in the village, and they heard a scream, and it was one of their friends' wives was being raped, and they went in and pulled that man right off of her, right on the spot, gave her a chance to get cleaned up, and they brought her and him into my camp. I circled two companies in that camp, and I asked for volunteers. I needed 3 men. 3 sergeants volunteered. These are native Wahao South Vietnamese, and they beat that man to death right there on the spot. Well, let me tell you, our camp, our entire area, from then on was known as the safest place in all of Vietnam for a female, for a woman. Now, that's the kind of operation that I ran. My men were not allowed to touch a Vietnamese girl.
Now, we're going to get into 2 things in the second half hour, so you listeners, make sure you come back after the break, Dan, Colonel. We want to get into your experiences in Vietnam, and then also this long ordeal of publishing your book that we'll get into. But one thing I want to ask you again before we get into the break is this about face you made in Finding the Lord. Tell me about that briefly before we go into this break.
Well, my daughter, Dana Lee, was in the U-Haul truck with me, and we were on the way to take some furniture to one of my other children, and she had the Bible open on her lap in the truck, and she was reading it out loud, and I asked her why she was doing that, and she said, well, I'm gonna talk to Mary about the Lord Jesus Christ. And I said,
we're gonna have to pick up there, Colonel, after the break, and then we'll get into the 2 other important aspects of your book and also your Vietnam experiences on the Investigative Journal. I'm Greg Szymanski, your host, on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Investigative Journal for the last half hour today. I'm visiting with Colonel Dangerous Dan Marvin, and he's telling us about life as a government assassin. And basically, we left off, Dan, where you're going to tell us a little bit about your Vietnam experiences when you went over as a Green Beret. Why don't you pick up there?
Let me give you the one psalm that I've kept in my heart ever since that day with Dan Lee when she led me to the Lord. Psalm 118:6. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear, what can man do unto me? You know, you keep that into your heart, and you know that, you know, people, I don't worry about the CIA. You know, there was the senior staffer of Congressman Matthew McHugh in 1997, I believe it was, called my home.
Right.
And told my wife that you didn't tell Colonel Marvin, just because I was fighting for all these causes to get the evil out of government, that you didn't tell Colonel Marvin that he may not be afraid of anybody but Jesus Christ, but remind him that he has grandchildren. Now, that was tough.
Yeah, what went through your mind there, and what did you do?
I just kept going, because I got down on my knees and I prayed, and as soon as Kate told me that no harm would come to my children or grandchildren, and it has not, the Lord protects them all because they're behind me on a project that is good in His eyes, and that's the thing that's most important. In Vietnam, I went over to command an independent operation, which at first was 5 companies, a civilian and regular defense group, and then I got an additional company because of all the enemy action. As we faced what was called the Southward Viet Cong Regiment, which had up to 2,400 men in it, and a secret base. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but one of the things that we found is that the Wahoos were treated by their government a lot like the blacks were treated by our government many years ago. And that was, there was not one doctor in that area, 64,000 people. My 2 medics, 2 sergeants, trained 12 midwives. We built 8 maternity houses. They trained 12 nurses. They trained 12 Vietnamese medics, soldiers. And they used to go out every day of the week and have sick call in the hamlets and little villages. And they see between 50 and 200 people, old men, women, down to children, and they'd pull teeth, anything that had to be done, as if they were a regular doctor. They carried that Merck manual, a little military edition of it, in their pockets, and that's what they used as a reference, but they had good medical training.
You know, Colonel, I wanted to get into the 2 areas that are of most importance of your Vietnam experience, one being the safe havens given by our government to the enemy, and the next being your involvement with the assassination of the Cambodian Prince Sihanouk.
Right.
Can you elaborate on those 2 issues?
Yes, the safe havens, that was really a serious problem. You know, on the way in to my camp, we crossed over a camp called Vinh Gia. It was sat right on the border, and I was told by a sergeant, and when I got to the B team, which was the team that I had to go through to get to mine, that a young captain commanded the A team there in Vinh Gia. They were right on the border canal. They fired 105 millimeter howitzers from the enemy positions on the other side of the border into his camp, killed 5 of his people, and he said to heck with it. They were ordered not to fire into Cambodia. He fired back at the enemy, as any good soldier should. He ended up within a day or 2, he was in the federal prison for disobeying an order and firing against the enemy.
Well, tell us how you found out about these safe havens and what you tried to do to stop them, to protect our soldiers who were getting killed.
When I was interviewed by Lieutenant Colonel William Tuttle, the C-Team commander. He commanded all the forces in the 4th Corps, and he asked me if I would volunteer to take the independent command of An Phu, and there was 30 miles of border, and that I would be the first one to be able to go into Cambodia, to fire across that border, to physically go into there after the enemy. But he said, when you leave this room, it'll be as if I never talked to you. And when you leave this room and you accept this job as the independent commander of An Phu, you got to realize that when you go into Cambodia, you have no support, no air support, no artillery support, and if you get hurt, you just be left over there, because there will be no medevac support either. And if you get captured, you'd be dropped as a deserter in the United States Army.
And what was your mission then?
My mission was to secure An Phu, the district of An Phu, and keep it safe for all the inhabitants, and not let, there was a test case. And there'll be something by the way, in the new book, The Devious Elite, that'll explain how my camp was being used as a test case for something something they were contemplating doing, otherwise allowing our men to fight back at the enemy. You know, at the same time, General Westmoreland, in his book, A Soldier Reports, get it out of the library, don't buy it, nobody deserves to make any money off that book. A Soldier Reports, he admits that he knew all about the sanctuaries. He knew that our government, President Johnson, allowed the Mekong River to be used by the enemy, and I personally witnessed this, by the way, it's in the book, use the Mekong River to haul tens of thousands of tons of weapons and ammunition into Cambodia for the enemy, then to kill us with.
So they had a secret mission to keep the war going instead of ending it, right?
He was ordered, General Westmoreland was ordered not to tell Congress and not to tell the American press. There's a man named Namkin, who was a GS-14, who told me a couple years later that he was the one that had built the facility that General Westmoreland used for talking to reporters and for talking to his officers, and it was two separate facilities in one, and the maps with the truth was on the one side, and the maps that he used to talk to the reporters was on the other side.
Now, I know these safe havens come up again in another assignment you were given, and that was to assassinate Prince Sihanouk of Cambodia.
Yeah.
Tell us about how this mission came about and what occurred during it.
CIA Special Agent Walter McKem, M-A-C-K-E-M, came into my camp one day, and Major Foy Van Lee, my counterpart, and I met with him in the command bunker, and he asked me if I'd volunteer to organize a group to go into Cambodia on a specific day and assassinate the Cambodian Crown Prince Sihanouk when he was on his annual visit to this temple. We were the closest camp to that area. So
I don't believe I ever asked you, what was the purpose of assassinating him? What was the our government's purpose?
Well, that was the next part of the instruction, is we were to make it look like the communists had done it.
Okay.
Not that we'd done it. So, I mean, we wore the same uniform the communists did anyway. We wore black pajamas almost all the time in all the battles. So I got 100 and some volunteers, and we picked 42 of them and started training them. But I'd given Walter McKem a quid pro quo. I said, President Johnson has got to take the sanctuaries away from the enemy. No longer be able to use the Mekong River. And I've got to be told that by a friend of mine at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, who will be watching the New York Times, which we trusted in those days, and listening to the radio. And 2 days before we were supposed to go into Cambodia to kill Sihanouk, the CIA agent came back to my camp, and he had no word at all. I wouldn't have accepted from him anyway. I told him, look, I haven't heard anything about President Johnson, the quid pro quo. He wouldn't even talk to me about it. So I ordered him out of my camp. And he said, you can't do that, Captain, because I unilaterally aborted the mission. He said, you can't do that, Captain, because you can't fight the company because you can't win. Well, within a week, there was a complete Marvin regiment of 1,500 men with all the weapons that they could muster.
Now, what's an Marvin regiment for the listeners who may not know?
1,500 men that are equipped with the biggest and baddest weapons that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam had. They had anti-tank weapons and everything, and they were coming up the Basak River, which was the river I controlled, with on LCUs, Navy landing craft utilities, and they were going to come up and destroy our camp because I'd gone against the company. Well, Major Foy Van Lee, my counterpart...
So now they're going to kill you?
Yes.
Our government?
Our government, because that's the main reason for the book.
Okay.
You know, when I went, we'll get into the publishing, but that'll come up there too. So Major Foy Van Lee went to send a runner, actually a man in an assault boat to...
I'm going to have to break it off right here because we got to take a quick break, but we'll come right back in the second half hour, and you're going to find out exactly what happened on the Investigative Journal.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn. The Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
Okay, we're back for the second half hour, the last segment before the weekend on this Friday, July 21st, 2017 day on our calendar. And before I get back to my good old buddy, Dan Marvin, let me just say this about all this stuff. You know, I remember always thinking about what Mark Twain said when he got older. And he was laying on his deathbed. And one of the comments he said always stuck with me. And this is when I was a lot younger and thought I was invincible, you know. And he said, he looked up, and you know, he was born under the Halley's Comet and died under it. He looked up and said, you know, as you get older, it seems like all your friends just go away. One after another. All your close relatives. And I'm here left alone with nobody to play with anymore, so maybe it's time to go. And he did go. So, you wonder about it. Here I go. Tony Alamo passes away. Dangerous Dan Marvin passes away. My good friend, the lawyer from South Carolina, who we did many, many shows, Robert Clarkson, on really the truth about the law that the income tax is a voluntary tax, which still nobody believes me. But listen, folks, I study the law and research it all the time. So I'm watching all my friends, and then I lose my dogs, and I'm going, my goodness. But that's maybe why I'm doing a couple of these shows. And I'm going to do one on Tony next week. Haven't heard his voice in a while. And it's Tony Alamo. And it takes me back in time. And when I'm sitting listening to Dan, I remember exactly where I was at. And I'm thinking back in 2005, what was going on? So then it got me thinking about the Vietnam War. And then I started thinking, going way back even farther. Many of you people out there probably never went through the Vietnam War. And I was in the first lottery. Now, you probably don't even know, it's not for money. They had, before the first lottery system, they needed boots on the ground, right? And so they were drafting up until the year I turned 18, and then they decided, we're going to do a lottery. And here's what we're going to do. Right now we need, where everybody has going to have a birthday. Everybody has a birthday, of course. But they will pick like balls out of a little thing, and every birthday will have a number. And so if you were 18 like me, here's what happens. We're all sitting at Walter Doolin's Tavern. I was in my first year of college. And we're watching the numbers come out, because at the time they told us, if you're 195 or below, you'll get draft orders immediately, you'll be in boot camp within 6 weeks, etc., etc. Oh, you can imagine the fun we were having that night. And that bar was packed. So anyway, it went on for a while. You got to go through 360 odd numbers, right? So my good buddy, he was the quarterback on the football team. I was a halfback. And I'll never forget, he lived in Des Moines, Iowa. He got number 3. Okay? But guess what? He had some kind of issue with his heart. I don't even know why I was playing football, and so he ended up not having to go anyway. Then another friend of mine who played left tackle, this big guy named John Turling, who went on to be a professional football player for the Detroit Lions. And me and him were pretty good buddies, and he was like 6'9", 300 pounds. And I could tell you some crazy college stories, but I won't do that today. But John got a very high number, and he was pleased. And then my good buddy, my best friend from, God knows, since I grew up, 3rd grade, he got a high number. He's not going, Mike Vergale. And then myself, I get my number. Guess what? Mr. Even Steven, right in the middle, 150-something. I go, oh, God. Everybody started saluting at me, hey, Sergeant Szymanski, see you later. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, I did end up getting my physical in Chicago, thinking, oh, no, my college career is over. I do not like my feet getting wet in rice. I just don't like wet feet. So I decided, well, maybe I'll go in the Air Force or something, or all these college recruiters out there. So I went, after I came back from my physical, they said, well, we'll get in contact with you in 6 weeks. I said, hey, don't rush it, Take your time. I'm not in a hurry to go to the rice paddies of Vietnam and get my head blown off. So anyway, I looked and I saw this Air Force recruiter, and I said, it might be nicer to be a pilot or something, So I went to him and I said, hey, can I fill out some docs? You know, I went and got my, I had to go get my physical in the Army. Can I still join you guys? He said, sure. They haven't sent anything to you yet, so yeah. You can come into the, you know, they were looking for people too. So I said, well, listen, give me the paperwork and I'll come back, because I still got a little time. I just got back from the physical in Chicago, right? So guess what happens? About a week goes by, I procrastinate. I was even trying to fill out the paperwork. And something said no, I just was too busy doing other stuff. Well, I went into Walter Doolin's Tavern. We were listening to Walter Cronkite. And he said, for all those first-timers that are in the lottery, we've got some good news for you. The draft numbers have been lowered to 125 and below. So I never had to go. But that's why I like doing a story like this with Dan Marvin. Good friend. I missed him. Hear his voice again. And it takes me back not only to that interview in 2005, but also the Vietnam situation. And many of you out there, probably younger than me, don't remember it. And I said this a long time ago after we learned how ridiculous this war was, and people were aware that we shouldn't have been there. And then Dan's telling you how they were manipulating people. And I said, if America doesn't learn from this war, we will never learn. And guess what? We're in deeper now than we were in Vietnam, so I'm telling you something. We are in deep trouble. Back to my good buddy, Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin.
Wahau Village, and to meet with the chairman of the Wahau Central Committee and ask him to go and talk to General Quang Van Dang, who trusted the Wahaus, believed in what we were doing there, had been in my camp a couple times. And he got a hold, as soon as he got to General Dang got Colonel William O. Desabry, who was his senior advisor, got in Desabry's chopper. They flew over that regiment, and Colonel Desabry called down to the Americans that were advising that regiment, because everybody had American advisors, and he asked them why they were attacking An Phu. And he said, because there's a renegade captain named Marvin who's leading the Wahaus against the central government. General Dang ordered them out of there, and he came personally into the camp in Colonel Desabry's chopper with a bunch of armed choppers supporting him, and gave us amnesty from the government.
Now, so he saves your life.
Right.
Now, how does he come back into your life after you left Vietnam?
Well, after I left there and I got saved and I started writing the book, once I had the second manuscript done after meeting with some of my men and everything, I wanted to reach General Dang and tell him the good news, but there'd be a book. And Major Foy Van Lee also. General Dang, it turns out, his character had been completely assassinated by the CIA. He was living in Canada, and this is a man that was the second highest man in Vietnam at the end of the war. He was
South Vietnamese Army, right?
South Vietnamese government.
Okay, and the man who saved your life.
That's right. He was assistant to President Thieu.
Okay.
He was in Canada washing dishes. He was even afraid to talk to me at first because the Americans had all turned against him. 3 generals had tried to get him approval to get into this country because they knew he was all right. And I knew the generals. One was General Desabry, and the other was General Heinkes, and another general. And our government wanted nothing to do with him being in this country because he knew too much.
Okay.
And so I found him, and I worked. It took a letter. In fact, this letter is going to be used in this trial against my book and me. On the 17th day of July, 1989, because the State Department and the CIA refused to do anything to help General Dang, I wrote President George Herbert Walker Bush, and I demanded that he order the State Department to do a government-wide investigation to clear General Dang of all the heinous acts, and I explained the assassination plot against Sihanouk. I explained the quid pro quo. I explained it all in my letter to President Bush, and then I slipped a little note in that letter. I think it was on pink paper, and I said, I am intimately familiar with your association with the CIA prior to your coming public.
Now, wait a minute. That's an important little note. Let me emphasize something here. President Bush always said his first involvement in the CIA was when he became CIA director.
Right.
However, you had information that he was working for the CIA's years in advance, correct?
Right.
And you write him a note.
I don't talk about that now, except the fact that I put that note in there.
Okay.
He met his part of the bargain. Within 3 weeks, the investigation was completed and General Dang was cleared. And then I went up. I made arrangements to go up and bring him from Quebec, Ontario, into the United States. Do I have any time left?
Oh yeah, we got another few minutes here, then a whole break, 5-6 minutes on the other side to talk about the lawsuit. But let me emphasize by what President Bush did. That's H. Bush, Herbert Walker Bush. But with that note that you gave him, he tacitly admitted to being involved, lying to the American people about when he really started in the CIA. That's my take on it.
That's right.
And now we have you with hard evidence showing that Dang got into America right after you put that note in, after he read that note, correct?
Something else has happened, too, and I made arrangements to go up there and get General Dang to rent a U-Haul truck up there and everything. I get a call from a friend in the CIA,
right?
And he said there's going to be an ambush on this side of the border. And I said, you mean they're going to try and kill General Dang and me? And he said, yes.
Oh, my God.
So I called a friend of mine in the New York State Police because I had been up to I was close with the New York State Police. I got a niece who's a trooper and her husband was a trooper. They're both retired now. But I went to my best friend who was in the state police, and he got 4 volunteers together and about 20 weapons. And he said, we'll go with you and we'll counter the ambush. So I called Congressman Matthew McHugh. And I said, Matt, there's going to be a lot of blood on the border unless you do something about it. And I explained everything except names. And so he called me back within an hour, believe it or not, that fast. And he says, man, you can tell General Dang the safest place in the world for him is to be with you coming across that border. Now, let me tell you how weird that was coming across the border. I went up and got him. We had dinner together and had a few drinks up there in Montreal, Quebec, and celebrated that he was going to have freedom. And we came down in the U-Haul truck to the border, and when we got to within about a mile of the border, all the cars and trucks were all pulled to the side of the road except us. We got into that checkpoint. We were the only non-government vehicle in that checkpoint. They never even went in the back of that truck. Now, that truck contained all of his worldly goods. Now, this is the guy that our government said was a billionaire from selling drugs in Vietnam. General Westmoreland accused his wife of running a chain of whorehouses up and down the coast of Vietnam. She's the sweetest lady you ever meet in your life. Anyway, that was his entire belongings didn't even cover the bottom of a 17-foot U-Haul, and he had one piece of furniture, a chair, that belonged to him. We got into there. The only people in that checkpoint, you've probably been through there, was just the officers there. And it took him about 20 minutes to clear General Dang because he was so afraid. His hands were sweating so bad he'd have to keep going to the bathroom and washing his hands in hot water, drying them off, and then taking fingerprints till they took him. They never went in the back of that truck. And we went from there, we went to McDonald's restaurant for our first American meal. But that was the ordeal that General Dang went through. And I immediately told Dang that I'd like to have him to my house, him and his wife Nam, for about 4 days. And I wanted him to write his complete history because I said, very shortly, the CIA will be calling you down to Langley, Virginia, and making you sign a secrecy oath. And they did, but I got his whole life in writing.
Wow. Now, is he still in the United States?
Yes, he is. He's in California. I just got a letter from him wishing me a happy 72nd birthday today, or yesterday, actually, and he's not feeling well at all.
Well, Colonel Marvin, we're going to finish with our last segment. I want to get into this lawsuit and the pending trial coming up on the Republic Broadcasting Network. I'm Greg Szymanski, your host on the Investigative Journal. We're back in the last segment of the Investigative Journal. I'm Greg Szymanski, your host, and I've got Colonel Dangerous Dan Marvin. Dan, let's get into this lawsuit. Now, it took you 15 years to publish this book. This information should have gotten out long ago, but it finally did with Trine Day Publishers. and now you're being sued, and and there's a trial date set for the end of October. Tell us about what's going on.
Yes, it was a real surprise to me, because if anybody reads my book, and they'll read about my team, my Green Beret team. They were the most wonderful men, courageous, wanting to help the Vietnamese people. It's just absolutely super all the way around.
We have about 5 minutes, Dan, so remember that.
Excuse me?
We have about 5 minutes, so try to get it all in.
Okay. In June of last year, I get a lawsuit in my hands, and in there is the men who are suing me as my own men, plus Colonel William Tuttle, the one who asked me if I'd take command of An Phu. So I called Raymond Johnson, who is one of the men, because he and I were very close, almost like brothers. We were going to meet, our wives and us, and celebrate our friendship a couple weeks after that, which we never have, of course. And I called him up and said, Ray, I'm hurt. Your name is on this lawsuit. And he says, I'm hurt too, Dai Huy. Dai Huy means Vietnamese for captain. He says, I can't talk about it. He says, all I know is they called me down there and told me to sign it, and I signed it, and that's it. Well, let me tell you, since that day, I think he's been drunk. When we had the mediation to try and settle this thing out of court, he could hardly talk. He could hardly stand.
So this basically is a Pentagon-backed lawsuit, then, correct? Federal lawsuit for libel?
Hello?
Yes.
When I tried to reach Lieutenant Strait, my XO, he's a retired major now, his wife answered the phone and said, Dan, I can't let you talk to John or we'll lose our retirement pay. Well, that's the kind of thing that's happened. They have selectively gone to my men, 5 of them, plus Colonel Tuttle, and they've intimidated them into representing the Special Forces Association, which is paying all the costs of the lawsuit on their side. And I am sure in my heart that they're doing it at the bequest of the CIA. People ask me, well, why didn't the CIA sue you for your giving all that top secret information? Well, that's exactly why they couldn't. In order to sue me for releasing top secret information, they'd have to admit that it's true.
Yep. And so now they filed a libel suit against you. What's the latest on this lawsuit? I know it took you maybe over 100 publishers before you even got it published. What's the latest on the lawsuit?
The latest on the lawsuit is tomorrow. We had the mediation. It completely failed. We're going to have what they call a conference with the judge who's going to hear the case. The jury's already been selected. It's supposed to be on the 31st of October, but we're hoping when we present him with all the evidence that we're going to provide, and believe it or not, most of the evidence is from the plaintiffs. It's audio tapes that they made telling me how great the book was and giving me stuff to add to it, like Lieutenant Strait, the man who I couldn't talk to on the phone, brought out the fact that I'd saved his life. And that's in the book now. I forgot all about it.
Right.
But that's basically, we talk to the judge at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Now, where's this being held at?
It's a telephone conference. My attorney, I have one attorney in South Carolina, one in Boston. The judge is in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina. And I'll be right where I am talking to you right now.
Okay, so we're going to keep up on this trial, Colonel Marvin. Thank you again, as always, for being straight up with us, telling us some things the American people need to know about the actions of our government. And this is the Investigative Journal. I'm Greg Szymanski. We'll be back with you tomorrow on the Republic Broadcasting Network.
Okay, I'm still here in 2017, magically, right? But anyway, let me finish on that, because, of course, that was in 2005. He had that court appearance, the telephone conversation. Let me tell you how this thing washed out. Dan, I'll get right to the point. It went to the jury. He won the case. He spent he was in debt about $200,000 in lawyer fees. And he didn't have the money to pay. And the lawyers basically, I think they almost did it pro bono. They allowed him to pay what he could over the rest of the period of his life. And I never got into the financials. But I think I talked to Dan maybe even 6 months before he died. He said he'd paid back about 2/3 of it. And I said, how'd you do it? He said donations, His buddy at Trine Day Publishing helped. So Dan said, I'm not leaving without, covering my debts, because he really appreciated the lawyers. He won the case. The jury believed him. And how he did it was he had taped all his men, basically saying that his story was true, and they played those tapes to the jury, and it basically resonated with the jury, who then understood that the CIA and the Pentagon had bribed his men to lie. And nobody was happier than his men, I think, who saw their captain not be, taken down like this with Pentagon lies. So he wins the case. And guess what? You don't hear about it in the news very much, do you? Did you hear it on the nightly news? That's a huge story. Oh, they suppress those, just like they suppress all the Vatican lawsuits that are out there. And the real interesting thing about this, Dan after he won that case, he kept going. He kept working. He had another book called The Devious Elite he was working on. And I remember that vividly back in 2011. I'll have to check to see if he got it finished. And even if he didn't, I'm sure you can go to expendableelite.com and get his original book and see how the next one is shaping up. Well, anyway, like I said, this show, it took me back to a lot of things, didn't it? Vietnam, when you were a kid in college. And I'm sure if you think about your life, some people don't like to think about. I love thinking about the past because I don't want to make the same mistakes in the future. So how can you not make those mistakes? You got to remember what the heck you did in the past. It's kind of a circuitous way of looking at life. But anyway, how are we going to end the show? I got 30 seconds. You know what? I'll just mention this. Today I was walking through Ensenada, and I walked into this little pet shop, and there were these two beautiful little white dogs. Puppies. Not big. They're going to be little guys. And I'm thinking, they were in the sun, so I put them under in the shade. And it's not kind of like the normal pet store in America. There are like rabbits there, and birds and ducks and all these animals. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I put my finger down by one of them, and they loved it. And I walked away saying, I don't think I'm ready yet. Back Monday. Have a good weekend on the Investigative Journal.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.